Welcome aboard. I'm Ted Everingham, and this is Great Lakes Log from WMTV at the Grosse Pointe War Memorial. Welcome to Bayview Yacht Club. We've talked on this program before about Bernida. Bernida was the boat that won the first Mackinac race way back in 1925. We've talked about her victory in 2012, and now there's a book about Bernida, a true story that can't be true. We'll talk about the book and the events that led up to it. A couple good guys here to help us. They've both been on the show before. Tom Irvin. Tom, you were on, we figured 7 years ago, to talk about your book, Victory.
That was the first book I wrote about Mackinac races, Ted. I've written 3 now. Really, I co-wrote this one with Al Clark, who did the lion's share of the work on this book. But I always love writing about Mackinac races. I think I'm done, though.
Well, I like talking about him, as Al knows. Al Clark,
hi.
Old friend, skipper, one-time owner of Bernida. The guy whose crazy idea it was to race a 90-year-old boat in the Mackinac race.
Well, it didn't seem that crazy at the time, but in retrospect, apparently it was.
How did, to recap briefly, Bernida won the race in 1925. She won again in 1927. Then she kind of disappeared, and she won again in the, 87th race, was it? 86th race?
Is that what this year's race was?
Well, last year, 2012,
yeah.
and she not only won her class, she won overall, Al. A really good story. How did the two of you team up to write this book? Whose idea was it?
Well, I called, I heard he was going to race this boat. I thought he was crazier than Al. Because this boat is, so old, so small, and but I watched it, and I watched him during the race, and I just thought, what a great story. It's such a small boat. It's so many lessons to learn. Age doesn't matter.
Thank you.
Size, thank you for that. Size doesn't matter, and appearance doesn't matter. This man had a vision, and so I called him and I said, Al, I would like you to think about writing a book about Bernida, but I said, I want you to think about it for a couple of weeks and see if this is something you'd want to do. And I called him 2 weeks later, and he said, yes, I've thought about it. I think it would be a fun thing to do. And so we then set about working on it together. And that's what happened.
And what Tom probably doesn't know is that I think I thought about it for less than a second and a half. By the time that I had hung up the phone, I had already thought that this would be a good thing to do. But I did wait the 2 weeks to call Tom.
Well, that was kind of you. I've known you a long time, Al, and as Tom was talking about you waiting for 2 weeks to make a decision, I thought, that's not the Al Clark I know. You make decisions very quickly, and this is one I would have predicted the outcome. You had the boat, by the time you got it back, Al, the story of the restoration and the lost years where we don't know where it was are all in this book, and I commend it to you. I thought the boat had kind of been lost longer than it had. In fact, it had been sailed from time to time, and the Sea Explorer Scouts had it, and been a kind of a Lake Michigan life. And then it disappeared, and Toby Murray found it, and then Bart Huthwaite got involved, and in 2003, Bart bought the boat. And that's where the modern story really begins. Al, how did you decide to buy this boat?
Well, it was interesting. As you know, that you introduced me to Bart shortly after they started the fundraising, and I gave Bart my business card and said, if I can help, let me know. Well, as they're getting near the end of the restoration, I did get a call from Bart, and he told me that Embry Burnell had sunk his fortune into this boat and that he was out of money, and wondered if I had some used sales or something like that that we could put on the boat. And after talking to Emery, it seemed to make a lot more sense just to build them a couple of new sails. So Sarah and Matthew and I flew up to Mackinac Island in the middle of February and met with Emery and got all the appropriate dimensions and helped Emery finalize the mast design and those types of things. And we built them a main and a jib, and so you could go sailing. And that at that point, I was kind of done with Bernida.
Right.
And then we saw the boat after one Mackinac out sailing, just looked great.
I remember
And
it well.
Then I got a phone call from Fred Detweiler, and he said, I heard that Bernida was up for sale on eBay. And I said, really? So I don't know much about eBay, but I figured out how to get to it and figured that it was for sale. And I came down to Bayview, and I was talking to a couple of friends here. And I said, you know, it's a real shame that this boat, that nobody has any interest in it. Well, a couple of beers later, they said, you know, maybe we'll just get that boat and go try and win one more Mackinac race. So I called them right from the Bayview bar and said that if he'd pull it off of eBay, that I'd buy it for his asking price. And he said, well, I need a minute to think about it. So about 2 minutes later, he thought about as long as I did on the book. He calls me back, and he said, if you'll buy it for the $15,000, I'll sell it to you. I said, great, pull it off of eBay. I'll mail you a check tomorrow.
That's the way it was.
Right.
Again, Tom, he makes decisions rather quickly. Emery was trained as a boat restorer, and the boat was actually restored on the Arnold's dock on Mackinac Island, right?
Right, and Emery did a really nice job. That when we got the boat from Emery, it didn't have any deck hardware on it, didn't have any winches, and the restoration was suitable for going out sailing on a nice day like today, with 10 miles an hour of wind or less, but it wasn't going to be strong enough to race.
Or competitive.
It wouldn't be competitive either. So what we did is we strengthened all the high load areas. The first thing we had to do is to change the mast design because in fact that the mast that Emery built for the boat was to the original design in 1921, and over the years they had upgraded. In fact, by 1925 they had already put a second mast in the boat that had 2 sets of spreaders and better sail control and those types of things. So that was our first step, is to get the mast right. And then we strengthened all the areas where the sails would attach. And this went, basically, we thought we knew what we needed to do prior to putting the boat in the water. But once we got the boat in the water, every time we'd sail the boat, we'd identify either something that needed to be fixed from a strength or a safety standpoint, or something that we could do to make it faster. So we'd sail the boat for a couple hours, and then we'd spend 2 weeks working on it. We'd sail it for a couple hours, and then we'd spend 2 weeks working on it, and went through that cycle until we finally got the boat right.
You tell this story, Tom, in the book. It must have been fun for you to chase this all down.
It was, and particularly the prior owners. And I called a lady, I tracked her down through Illinois and finally out to Arizona, and her husband loved this boat. He was a doctor, and he had the boat for 18 years on Lake Pentwater, and he had his family out regularly. He just loved this boat. And she could not believe the boat was still around, nor could she, the lady at the time was 92, and I talked to her, she could not believe also that it won the Mackinac race. So
yeah.
I had fun talking to some of the prior owners. Great stories.
Well, and that's part that I thought I knew a lot about Bernida. I'm fascinated by the boat. I've known Al for years, but until I read your book, yours and Al's, I didn't realize that there were a series of owners who actually, Al, you had the same experience. You didn't realize there was this period of time where the boat was actually being sailed and used and enjoyed.
Right. I think most of us around Bayview felt that this boat disappeared around 1927 and went into a barn and stayed there until Toby and Bart found it. In fact, that I think you tracked down probably 6 owners, and the boat changed hands in some creative ways. One owner traded a Cadillac and a shotgun and a rifle for it, and there were a variety of other creative deals that made this thing happen. So
it is a fascinating story that you tell, and it's that's the lost history even to Al, and certainly to me. Tell me about the crew. One of the intriguing stories about this race in 2012, Al and Bernida, is the crew.
Well, we had 3 fathers and 3 sons. Within seconds after buying the boat at the Bayview Bar, I already knew who I wanted to sail on it. So I called Fred Detweiler and Ken Flaska, 2 of my oldest and best friends and guys that I've sailed all over the world with. And we've been pretty successful. Told them what we were up to and told them I'd like them to sail and have each of them bring their son. And the 6 of us would try and do this again. And as you imagine that they thought this was a bit crazy. On the other hand, it didn't take long for them all to agree to do it.
Well, they'd all known Al for his crazy ideas. You always think out of the box a little bit.
So, and Ken and Connor were on board for the Flaskas immediately. Ward Detweiler was on board immediately. And Fred was a bit of the common sense guy. He said, we can't sail this boat to back. I said, don't worry. By the time we get to the starting line, it will be safe.
And you know, Tom, you captured all that attitude here. I know all these people. And if you had asked me about who was the most reluctant to accept, I'd have said Fred, because I know Fred. And Ken would be aboard right away. And I don't know the boys, I know you're Matthew. But you captured that. I thought you captured that very well.
Well, they're all, one thing we have to understand, when this boat started out on the starting line, it was really in good shape. And Al knew what had to be done to the boat, and he knew the people that he needed to help him do it, number one. And then number 2, you had an excellent crew. I mean, these were very, very good sailors, all 6 of them. So you had an excellent crew aboard a boat that really had been thought through. And I think, Al, talk about the pumps you had on the boat. This, to me, is a big part of the story.
Well, we had a great pump system. One of the things that would happen in the spring before we could start working on the boat is we had a couple of big rainfalls. So we come down to Bayview and figure, well, we're going to pump the boat out. There isn't a drop of water in the boat because it all ran through. So now when we get the boat into the water, there's just streams. It looks like hoses coming in. But the boat eventually swelled up, and most of that stopped. But anytime you would load it up, you'd open the seams back up again. So the one thing that we knew is that we weren't going to be able to keep the water out. So if that were the case, we were going to have a good way to get it out of the boat. So we got a big manual pump that we felt would be capable of doing the job, but nobody wants to spend the whole day pumping away on this thing. So we also had 2 big bilge pumps that were battery driven, and then we had a Honda generator to charge the battery. And kind of as a test, in the well right over to the left of us here, that one day I put a hose in the boat, and it took 3 hours to fill it up. And it filled it up until the boat was within a few inches of the water line, and turned the hose off, turned the pumps on. 20 minutes later, the boat was empty. Excellent. So I felt like we had good pumping capacity.
You had a 200-gallon-a-minute pump on there.
So, yes. Yeah, well, that's a lot of pump. There's a lot of water.
As I said, we knew we couldn't keep it out, so we wanted to be able to get rid of it.
Another thing, Ted, there was no motor on this boat.
Of course
have to
not.
keep that in mind.
Yeah.
So in order to escape a storm or something, they didn't have that.
They had to sail.
Yeah.
They had to sail.
Well, and that was one of our deals with the Bayview Yacht Club before buying the boat, is that we were going to sail the boat in the same configuration as it sailed in 1925. And they said, well, you're going to have a motor? I said, no. He said, you're going to figure out some way to get the cockpit self-bailing? No. You're going to put lifelines on? No. I said, we either get to sail it in the same configuration that it sailed in 1925, or we're not going to sail it. So they reluctantly agreed. They did agree get us to agree to have a chase boat in exchange for allowing us to sail with a boat that they didn't deem particularly safe. But it made it there in 1925. It made it there in 1927. So I guess it was safe.
Well, and it did an awfully good job in 2012. But you, as much, I mean, you're a sailmaker. You understand forces. You knew what had to be done to make the boat stronger and more competitive. Yet for all of that forethought and all of the work that went into it, every time, as you mentioned, you took the boat out sailing, you found something